Hi, good morning everybody. Welcome to IndyCar on Wednesday the 29th of May 2019. In the show today I've got three items to discuss with you. One of them is a request for help with a march. The other one is a request for other help with accommodation. I'll explain both of those in a moment. And the final one is to discuss how leaving one union and staying in another gives us back control. So first let's look at a request for, not so much help, but request for people to come on a march. Now those of you who've been on marches in the past for independence will know that in the main they've happened in either the central belt or large towns and cities. And one area of Scotland which has traditionally been assumed to be very largely pro-UK has been the border counties of Scotland. But that has recently changed, and I think the recent vote for the European elections has proved that, because the border counties of Scotland also voted overwhelmingly to stay in the EU. And so there are obviously people in the borders of Scotland who have now changed their minds, not only about staying in the EU, but also about staying or leaving the UK. And with that in mind, it's been pointed out to me that there is a march coming up on Saturday, and I said I would get the message out. In Galasheils this Saturday at 1:30 there will be an independence march. As far as I'm aware, this is the first time an independence march has taken place in that border town, and so this is a big day for Galasheils. As I say, people had assumed for many years that it wasn't worth campaigning for independence in the border towns and the border counties of Scotland because of the large influx of people from across the border, and I suppose the fear that separating ourselves politically from England would in some way cause problems with cross-border trade or with people who worked in farms and communities which straddled the border. But apparently this is not an issue anymore, and I'm here really basically to remind you that there is a march in Galasheils on Saturday, this coming Saturday at 1:30. So anybody who is at a loose end on Saturday feels like attending a march and helping out the Yes campaigners in Galasheils, get yourselves down to Galasheils on Saturday early on so that you can rally at 1:30. There will be more details published online, and I'll try and provide some more of them later in the day on my Facebook page. Now the second item today I wanted to do, it's not normally a request show, but today I felt it was important to honour some obligations to people who are important to Scotland on the independence cause. And one of those, probably the most prominent person I can think of at the moment, is Dr. Mark Mcnaught. He is the author of the new Scottish, or one of the new Scottish constitutions. I have to be fair here, there have been other constitutions written, but Mark, as a political science lecturer, is an expert on constitutional law, and writing constitutions is his speciality. Anyway, Mark is the man who has prepared and written a Scottish constitution ready for us to use after we're independent, and he is planning to come to Scotland with a research fellow this summer. He'll be coming to Scotland to stay for a long period of time over the summer, between June and August as far as I understand. And he's asked me if anyone out there has any spare capacity, any houses where they can rent a couple of rooms. At the moment, Mark is looking for some cheaper accommodation because it's a longer stay, and to go and stay in hotels for that length of time would be prohibitively expensive. So if anyone has any spare rooms, or if anyone has a holiday let somewhere in the central belt, preferably between Glasgow and Edinburgh, that would be ideal, somewhere where the rent would be a little bit more reasonable. Mark has said he's prepared to pay for the accommodation, he just can't afford the massive expense of hotel bills. So if anyone has any accommodation available during the months from June through June and July to August, please let me know, and I'll pass your details on to Mark so that he can bring his research fellow over, and they will be working with the SNP, with the Yes movement throughout the summer. Okay, finally on to the last item today. This is more a general piece of news. There's been a lot of misinformation about taking back control. Now, you probably heard this issue of taking back control from people like Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson with regards to leaving the European Union. But unfortunately, Farage and Johnson are omitting to tell you something very important about the European Union, and that is that in the UK, over 99% of all the laws passed in the UK are passed in the UK. And 99% of the decisions made in the UK about how tax money is spent in the UK are made right here in the United Kingdom. So there's only 1% of control is ceded to Brussels, and that 1% of control is over freedom of movement of European citizens only. Now that means that the UK has to allow freedom of movement for other European nationals, not immigrants, not asylum seekers, and not people from outside the EU. So that means all of these fears about a massive influx of people flooding across Europe into the UK is nonsense. We know for a fact, I mean, if you look at the news, you will see that the numbers of people who even cross the channel every day on small boats trying to get to England number in the ones and twos. You can count them on the fingers of one hand. Italy, on the other hand, sees migration in the thousands, with hundreds of people packed on boats making the crossing from North Africa to Italy. So the UK is not under any threat from freedom of movement. And in fact, freedom of movement ensures that we get the right types of people to work in the UK in jobs that are essential. Jobs in the health service, for example, jobs in education, jobs in farming and agriculture and fisheries, and also jobs in the city and in the banking sector. So it benefits us. So this nonsense about us having no power because we're in the EU has been put about by the Leave campaign for many months, and a lot of people believe it. But when it comes to Scotland's freedom, and its freedom politically, and its control, the levels of control that Scotland have at the moment over not only public spending, but the amount of taxation which is removed from Scotland every year, and the amount of taxation which belongs to us, which is returned to us each year, is tiny. We have only 15% control over taxes and the way the money is spent in Scotland. 15% control. The UK has 85% control over our taxes and where the money is spent. Over 40% of the taxes sent from Scotland to England, to basically to the Treasury, our taxation, 40% of it is removed by England. We never see it again. It's taken from us. We get back the balance. They call it the block grant, but it's not a grant. It is what's left after the UK has top sliced all of our taxation so that they can spend 40% of our tax money in England and Wales and Northern Ireland. So what does it mean for us to leave one union but not another? Well, let's put it this way. If we leave the UK union, we recover 100% of our tax raising powers. We retain 100% of control over defence. That would mean we could remove nuclear weapons from our soil, from our lochs. We would be in charge of defending ourselves. We could decide how much of our national income is spent on defence. Instead of 3%, we could be spending 1%. That would mean billions more in funding for things like the National Health Service, for education, and for local authorities. So that's the first thing. Leaving the small union of just England and Scotland would benefit us massively. 60% of our taxation that we currently have at our disposal would go from 60% to 100%. We would go from trying to run the country on £33 billion a year to running it on nearly £60 billion a year, doubling the amount of money going into the Scottish Exchequer and allowing us to put money into a central fund, a common good fund for the rest of Scotland's future that we can't do at the moment because England is spending it elsewhere. Now, let's think for a moment what would happen if we leave the European Union and remain inside the UK. What will happen is, if we leave the European Union and remain in the UK, we lose all trade deals with the European Union at a stroke. A no-deal Brexit would end the free movement of goods, of capital, of services and of people. It would be impossible to trade smoothly with Europe. The cost of goods coming into Scotland would go up by approximately 25 to 30%. The cost of our goods being sold abroad would go up by similar amounts, making our goods in Europe too expensive for Europeans to afford, and making European goods too expensive for us to afford. That would mean that there would be shortages on both sides of the channel. Shortages of Scottish goods, because nobody can afford them, would be uncompetitive, and in Scotland shortages of European imports such as food, dairy products, white goods, cars even, all kinds of different products would be far too expensive for us to afford. So not only that, but because our exports would have been cut dramatically by up to 25%, we are going to lose jobs. Our exporting market in Europe is worth 40% of Scotland's exports each year. So that 40% could drop, and it could drop a long way. And when it drops like that, what happens is production drops as well, as companies then scramble to try and find other markets and try to make new trade deals with fewer countries, because there are fewer left to trade with that we haven't already got trade deals with. Because we've been leaving the European Union, we actually would not have any trade deals with anybody else, because all of the trade deals that the UK has at present, and that's hundreds of them, certainly over 70 of them at the moment, those would no longer exist. And we would spend, or rather the UK would spend years and years negotiating new treaties and new arrangements for trade with all of the countries which we already have trade deals with through Europe. It could take decades before the whole of the UK finally comes out the other end of this process. And in that process, we'll have lost trillions of pounds worth of revenues that we would normally earn from in Scotland, our trading in the black. We make a profit every year in Scotland. That would end. We would go into recession almost immediately. Jobs would be lost. People's homes would be at risk. Living standards would fall. Unemployment would increase. Homelessness would increase. The pressures on the NHS would ramp up. There would be cuts across the board, hyper austerity. All of these things would destroy the Scottish economy virtually overnight if we stayed in the UK and came out of the EU. But what if we did the opposite? What if we stayed in the EU but came out of the UK? Well, I've already pointed out, we would have 100% of our funding. All of our tax revenues would be here. That is nearly £60 billion a year instead of 30. So having that increase in taxation allows us to spend more on the things that we need. Things like public services. We could perhaps renationalise one or two things like the railways, like the power grid. We could start the gradual nationalisation of key national assets, such as renewable energy, because that is an asset for everybody. Water could become a national asset as well, and that can be and still should be publicly owned. The rail network should really be publicly owned and publicly operated. Even buses could be run again by local authorities or by the public sector, because fares and the lack of buses on certain routes that are relatively unprofitable means that people are trapped in outlying villages and can't commute. So there are all sorts of problems that we could solve if we left the UK straight away. But how would it sit if we left the UK and remained in the EU? Well, if we remain in the EU, at least for the time being, then nothing will change in terms of trade. We would still trade with the European Union without any taxes or tariffs on goods, services, people and finance flowing back and forwards across the North Sea into and out of mainland Europe. Now, because of that, we also have to pay for that. Now, let's not kid ourselves on, it costs money to be in the EU. There is a fee to pay. But in Scotland's case, that is going to be a fee based on our much smaller population. And that means we're going to be looking at something like a tenth of what the UK is paying at the moment to be in the EU. And that might just be a few hundreds of millions. I don't know, I'd need to work it out. I'm sure somebody out there with a calculator could do this for me. But whatever it is, it's easily dwarfed by the massive amount of profits that we make from our trade surplus. And not only that, but we could increase our trade surplus because we would be free and we'd have more money and there would be more people working. We could increase our productivity dramatically and at the same time increase our foreign exports even further. Not to mention the massive and growing market for Scotland's renewable energy, which is only just at its beginnings just now. When this renewable energy system that Scotland is setting up, the network of offshore wind and tidal turbines, is fully working and exploited, it will dwarf the oil industry. The amount of energy Scotland will be able to produce will easily replace all the petroleum that is powering cars and buses and trucks and trains at the moment, and planes, by the way, will easily supply enough electricity to electrify almost every form of transport. Even, believe it or not, aircraft can finally be run on green fuels. That's a more difficult task, but it's not impossible. So the future for Scotland staying in the EU is that we would be much more secure. People have worried that there are going to be something like a European army. Now, this was suggested many years ago by two fairly powerful men in the EU, but it's never been acted on, and the idea of it has never been successfully proposed to the European Parliament or the Council of Europe. It's not been actioned, but it might well be that with America now becoming very anti-European and America pulling its forces away from strategic positions, it might well be that the European Union feels it's necessary to have a combined defence force to protect its borders, say, with Russia or with other countries where there is instability. But that doesn't mean that Scotland needs to be a nuclear power, nor does it mean we even need to be necessarily in NATO, although we could be, but we don't need to be a nuclear power, and we would have control over whether we have nuclear weapons or not. And having control over whether we have nuclear weapons or not means we can tell the British government to take their nuclear submarines out of Faslane, Coalport, any other place where they're currently lurking just now, and take them away down to England where they have existing facilities for their submarines elsewhere. And let England, if it wishes to have the nuclear filth and the danger of 200 massive atomic warheads, 8 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bombs, if they want to have them on their doorstep, then that's up to them. But take them away from Scotland. We do not need them. We can form our own defence force, and really the defence of Scotland has to be coastal, because our main assets are going to be our energy networks. And our energy networks are all going to be fairly remote around the coastline of Scotland, and they will need to be protected from incursions by other countries' armed forces or navies. Submarines are particularly a problem if you have offshore tide turbines and wind turbine arrays. You have the risk of vessels colliding with those. Although it's very difficult for people to actually take them over, they can be sabotaged simply by blowing up the subsea cables. So they are vulnerable, and we would need a very modern new navy, and that would mean massive new orders for the shipyards of Scotland to build the latest state-of-the-art hydrogen electric powered ships capable of the kind of performance existing ships have, but without all of the pollution. And having developed that technology, Scotland would then be able to export that as well. So the benefits of being a free nation again, being a country on our own again, with our own choices, with all our own taxation, but with 99% of the laws of Scotland made here. The only control that we would cede to the European Union would be over things like like immigration, right? But only immigration from Europe. Scotland would have full control of immigration from every other part of the world, including the hotspots, the war zones like Syria, like Iran, Iraq, Libya, places where people are fleeing warfare. And Scotland has always been welcoming towards refugees who are trying to escape either persecution, death or torture. And that's something we would want to continue doing. As a small country with a small population, having a small number of refugees coming in every year does nothing to hurt our country, and it does everything to boost Scotland's outstanding in the world when it does this kind of thing. We'd also be able to spend considerably more time on helping other countries to recover from things like warfare. We would win contracts to help rebuild countries with the knowledge that we have of renewable energy systems, water management systems, and all kinds of other things that we are extremely good at. These are talents, these are things that we can export around the world, these are things that we can put to good use in areas that have been destroyed by Western imperialist warfare. So that's about it for me today. I just wanted to point out that leaving one union and staying in another, this is, somebody pointed out, this is a little bit like Game of Thrones. Which union do we choose, right? Which combination of unions do we want? Do we want to stay in a tiny union which is going nowhere into isolation and which has a faltering, failing economy and is going backwards in time, and reject a massive union of 27 forward-looking countries where we have terrific trade? Do we reject that in favour of this small backward union, or do we reject the small backward union in favour of staying connected to our massive trading bloc next door? And I think it's a no-brainer, really. I've never seen it as anything else. It's always been a no-brainer. Scotland needs to be European. It needs its export markets, it needs its connections, and it needs to get back control over all of its resources and all of its taxation. And those are currently being held hostage by a hostile Tory government in England which has no idea what it is doing anymore. So now is the time for people who have been sitting on the fence, who maybe voted no in 2014, to now think again about what is safest for them. Is your job safe under the UK? Is your job connected to the UK defence industry in any way? Is your job connected to a company which is based in London in any way? Is your job in a British retail chain? Because those are closing shops by the hundreds at the moment all over the country. These are things you need to think about, and you have to think about what the future is going to be for not just you, but your children and your grandchildren. What do you want to leave them as your legacy? Do you want to leave them a chaotic, austere, poverty-ridden, disaster area of a country which is going nowhere and has no friends? Or do you want to be part of this new renaissance of Scotland, coming back into the world as a fully fledged country, the leading light in green technology, and a new way of trading with the world without polluting it? The future is very bright for Scotland, and it only takes one or two people to change their minds. If you change one or two people's minds in the next few months, then we will easily get our independence. And all of the institutions for the new Scottish state are being put in place right now. Tax offices are in place, benefits office is in place, the new investment bank is in place. There are all kinds of new institutions being built as you speak, and quietly and steadily Scotland is working its way towards its freedom again and being back to where it belongs. I'll see you all later. I say it's such a rainy day, but look ahead. The future is bright. Even on a day like this, the future is bright, and we just have to take a step in the right direction. Bye.